The sun had just begun its slow crawl over the endless horizon, painting the prairie in shades of gold and amber. Dust swirled gently around the worn wooden posts of the small ranch house, carrying with it the faint scent of sagebrush and dry earth. The cowboy leaned against the railing of the porch, hat pulled low over his eyes, staring out at the open fields, as if he could read the secrets hidden in the wind. Life out here was quiet, but it wasn't easy. There were long days, longer nights, and a loneliness that gnawed at a man no matter how many cattle he tended or fences he mended. The empty chair at the dinner table was a constant reminder of that solitude. He'd come to this stretch of land for the promise of work and the hope of leaving the past behind. The neighbors were few, the nights dark, and the silence deep. Every sound, the creak of a floorboard, the distant howl of a coyote, the rattling of the wind through the old barn, felt sharper in a house so empty. He had hired a few hands over the months, but none had stayed. They were drawn to the open horizon, the call of the trail, or just the chance for something different. But the cowboy stayed, and the table remained half full, the other half a cold reminder of the companionship that had slipped through his fingers. When word came that a young native woman was passing through the county, offering her skills as a cook, he wasn't sure what to expect. Folks in town whispered about her, how she had a way of making a simple meal taste like a feast, how her eyes carried the stories of generations long gone, and how she seemed to belong everywhere and nowhere all at once. He figured a good cook could fill the empty table, at least for a while. But something about the thought unsettled him, a flicker of curiosity he couldn't ignore. The first morning she arrived, the smell of fresh bread and coffee drifted from the kitchen before he even heard her voice. It was different from the usual fare. Tasteful, heavier with spices he couldn't name, and the quiet warmth of someone who knew how to make a place feel lived in. He stood in the doorway, arms crossed, trying to measure her with the kind of cautious appraisal that came from years of running his own ranch and keeping his own company. She moved with a quiet grace, unhurried but purposeful, and her gaze, calm and steady, met his once and lingered just long enough to make him notice more than just her presence. He found himself sitting at the table earlier than usual that evening, watching her work, watching how she set the plates and ladled the stew with care. The table, once bare, except for the essentials, seemed to fill with something more than food. There was warmth, a rhythm to her movements, a sense of home that had long been absent from this house. And yet the empty chair remained. Gosh. Every time he glanced at it, he felt a tug in his chest he didn't want to name. The cowboy wasn't a man used to conversation that didn't involve work or cattle, yet she spoke easily, stories slipping from her lips like water over stone. She told him of the trails she'd crossed, of the rivers she'd camped beside, of the small towns where people had looked past her or simply ignored her. Her words were simple, but they carried weight, a quiet honesty that made him uneasy in ways he hadn't expected. For the first time in years, he realized that the empty chair wasn't just a reminder of solitude, it was a space waiting to be shared, if only he could let it. Evenings grew longer, and the nights colder, but the kitchen glowed with the soft light of a lantern and the smell of simmering stew. The cowboy would catch himself lingering by the door watching her work, the way she hummed softly under her breath as she stirred, or the way her hands moved with care over each dish. There was an unspoken understanding between them, a quiet companionship that didn't need words. But still, the empty chair remained, and every meal ended with him staring at it, wondering if one day it might be filled not just by food, but by someone willing to stay. There were small moments that made him wonder if he had underestimated her. She had a knack for knowing what he liked without him saying, a word a pinch more, salt here, a dash of something fragrant there. She spoke to the land as though it could answer her, and sometimes, in the silence of the late night, he swore he heard the wind carry her voice across the prairie. The more time passed, the more he felt the walls of his house shrink and the spaces between them fill with life. Yet he hesitated, unsure if this intrusion of warmth was something he could trust or simply another fleeting comfort destined to vanish with the morning light. The first storm came in quietly, a soft rumble of distant thunder that grew into gusts rattling the window panes. He found himself seated at the table alone until she brought the food, eyes catching his in a glance that seemed to ask something unspoken. They ate in silence, the storm outside a reminder of how fragile the world could feel. Yet inside the house there was a strange kind of safety. Still, he kept his distance. The empty chair stared back at him, patient and insistent, and he realized that it wasn't just about hunger or warmth. It was about letting someone into the spaces he had long sealed off. Days rolled into weeks, and the rhythm of life on the ranch began to change in subtle ways. The cowboy noticed how the dogs seemed calmer, how the horses moved with less tension, and how the air itself felt lighter when she was around. There were hints of laughter now, the kind that bubbled up unexpectedly, breaking the old silence that had ruled the house. He started looking forward to the sound of her voice in the morning, the sizzle of bacon on the skillet, the smell of biscuits straight from the oven. Yet every meal ended with a glance at that empty chair, and every glance left him wondering if he was ready for the truth it demanded. She never pressed him, never asked questions he wasn't ready to answer. Her presence was steady, grounding, like the roots of a tree that had seen many seasons. And in those quiet evenings, he felt a tug at his heart, a longing he had buried beneath years of hard work and solitary nights. The table was full now, but the chair beside him seemed to hold more than just space. It held possibility, a promise, and perhaps a challenge to the walls he had built around himself. The tension between what was and what could be hung in the air, subtle but impossible to ignore. He knew that at any moment the fragile balance could shift. She could be gone with the wind, or he could finally take a step he hadn't dared in years. As he stared across the table at her, the firelight dancing in her eyes, he felt the weight of the empty chair like never before. It was a question, a dare, and a whisper all at once. Could he fill it with more than food, with more than companionship, and risk the vulnerability that came with letting someone in? The first time he noticed the way she lingered after a meal, brushing crumbs from the tablecloth with quiet care. He realized that this wasn't just about cooking or keeping the house in order. She was here to stay, or at least, she was trying in her own way, and the cowboy had a choice to make. Could he welcome her fully, or would he retreat into the comfort of his empty chair, the predictable silence he had long relied on? Outside, the prairie stretched endlessly, the wind whispering secrets of change and opportunity. Inside, the table was set, the food warm, and the empty chair waited, patient and insistent, for an answer he was not yet ready to give. Night fell, and the stars spilled across the sky like spilled salt. The wind softened to a gentle murmur, carrying the faint scent of pine and distant rivers. The cowboy sat back, hat tipped low, listening to the quiet hum of the house and the subtle rhythm of her movements in the kitchen. He knew that life was on the brink of something different, something he could not yet name. The empty chair remained, the table was full, and the possibility of what came next stretched out before him, uncertain and enticing. He took a slow breath, feeling the tension coil in his chest, knowing that tomorrow would bring a choice, and that choice could change everything. The night seemed to hold its breath, and in that pause, the cowboy understood that the story of his life and the life of the woman who had entered it so quietly was only just beginning. The prairie outside, wide and endless, seemed to mirror the unknown path ahead. And somewhere deep inside, he felt the stirrings of something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. The morning came slow and pale, the horizon a soft wash of pink and orange that made the prairie look almost gentle, though the land beneath it was hard and unforgiving. The cowboy was already up, as always, moving through the familiar rhythm of chores. The horses needed feeding, the fences checked, the cattle counted. He worked with a quiet focus, letting the dawn chase away the shadows of the night and the weight of thoughts he hadn't yet voiced. The wind carried the scent of damp earth from a far-off creek, and he wondered, not for the first time, how this stretch of land had once looked to the people who had lived here long before him. She appeared in the doorway as he worked, a basket of fresh eggs in her hands, sunlight catching the strands of her dark hair. She had a way of moving that made the simplest tasks seem graceful, and he found himself watching, almost against his will. As she balanced the eggs and set them down on the rough wooden table, he was beginning to notice the little things, the curve of her smile when she saw something amusing, the way her hands moved over the dishes, how her eyes seemed to hold stories he would never fully know. They hadn't spoken much about her past. She had only said that she had been moving across the country, offering her cooking wherever she could find work, traveling with little more than the clothes on her back and the memories she carried with her. But he suspected there was more, the quiet strength she carried, the way she could read the land and its creatures as if she belonged to them. hinted at a life far more complex than the one she let him see. Over breakfast, the cowboy tried to fill the silence with questions. But she was careful, answering with short, precise words that revealed enough to satisfy his curiosity without giving away too much. She spoke of rivers that curved like silver ribbons through the land of towns where people had treated her with indifference. Nights spent under endless skies, counting stars to pass the time. And yet, even in those stories, there was something that made him uneasy, a sense of loss, or perhaps memory, that lingered behind her eyes. The ranch itself had a history that wasn't easy to uncover. The land had once been part of a larger spread, owned by men whose names had long since faded from memory, who had built fences and barns and left their own marks in the earth. There were whispers in town about old rivalries, about cattle rustling, arguments over water rights that had turned neighbors into enemies. The cowboy had heard fragments, little bits of gossip filtered through the dusty saloons and the post office, but nothing concrete. Still, there was a feeling in the air that the land itself remembered, that it held grudges and stories the wind would whisper to those willing to listen. She had noticed it too, though she never said so directly. Sometimes she would pause while setting a dish on the table, glance toward the hills in the distance, and a shadow would cross her face. The cowboy tried to catch her in those moments, to ask what troubled her, but she would simply shake her head and continue with her work. There was a patience about her, a quiet acceptance that some things were better left unspoken. And yet her eyes always seemed to carry a question, or perhaps a warning, that made him sit a little straighter and notice the way the prairie seemed to hold its own secrets. It wasn't long before small tensions began to surface. The neighboring ranchers eyed him curiously when he rode into town, and some made passing remarks about the young woman in his kitchen. She wasn't from around here, and that fact alone seemed enough to spark suspicion. The cowboy didn't pay much attention to gossip, but he felt it in the shift of eyes, the quick glances that followed him across the dusty street, the way conversations would pause when he entered a room. He started wondering whether he had invited more than just a cook into his home, whether he had unknowingly brought someone into the middle of old grudges and unspoken dangers. At night, the prairie became even more mysterious. The wind carried sounds that didn't belong, branches snapping in patterns that suggested movement. The low cry of an animal that he couldn't identify. She would sit by the stove, stirring soup or mending a tear in an old blanket, and he would catch her pausing to listen, her expression unreadable. Sometimes, in the flickering light of the lantern, he thought he saw shadows shift along the walls, shadows that seemed almost human in their movements, though he never spoke of it. The house, once empty and silent, had grown alive in ways that were comforting and unsettling all at once. One afternoon, while repairing a section of fence, he overheard the distant sound of hooves. He squinted toward the horizon, where dust rose in faint plumes, and felt a familiar unease tighten in his chest. Travelers or trouble, he couldn't tell. He returned to his work, hands steady, but thoughts racing. Feeling the presence of the girl behind him, quietly observing, her posture alert and patient. She never spoke, but he could tell she had noticed too. There was an unspoken agreement between them now, a shared understanding that life on the prairie wasn't always predictable, and that vigilance was a form of survival. At the table that evening, the food tasted richer, more comforting than ever. Yet he couldn't shake the feeling that the calm was fragile. The empty chair still loomed beside him, more insistent now, as if daring him to confront the questions he had been avoiding. He realized that it wasn't just a question of companionship, but of trust. Could he trust her with the story he had buried, the memories he had kept from the world, the mistakes and regrets that had followed him across every mile of prairie and trail? And could she trust him with her own story, the shadows in her past that she had kept hidden beneath her calm exterior? Days passed, each one bringing small signs that their lives were intertwining in ways neither had expected. He noticed how the dogs seemed to gravitate toward her, how the horses calmed when she approached, how even the wind seemed less harsh around the house. The kitchen became a hub of warmth and laughter, and yet, behind the comfort, the air thrummed with quiet tension. He began to understand that the empty chair wasn't just a symbol of solitude, it was a challenge, a test of courage, and a mirror reflecting the risks he had avoided for too long. Late one evening, after the work was done and the fire burned low, she spoke of a place far to the north, a settlement she had passed through that seemed to have left a mark on her spirit. Her voice was calm, almost wistful, but he sensed a trace of fear beneath the words. A hesitation that made him lean closer, searching her face for understanding. She didn't offer details, only fragments, and he realized that the more he learned about her, the more mysteries he uncovered. Her past was a map he could read only in pieces, and each fragment made the empty chair seem heavier, laden with questions he wasn't sure he wanted to answer. The cowboy began to notice small anomalies around the ranch. A gate left ajar that he was certain he had closed, footprints in the dust that didn't match his own, the occasional distant cry at night that seemed too deliberate to belong to an animal. He didn't accuse her, how could he, when she was the only person who made the house feel alive? But he began to watch, to measure, to question, all while maintaining the delicate balance of civility and trust. Every glance across the table carried weight, every shared meal a negotiation between curiosity and caution. And yet, despite the tension, he felt drawn to her in ways he had not anticipated. It was more than the way she filled the table or the house. It was the way she seemed to understand the spaces between words, the silences that carried meaning, the unspoken needs of a man who had lived too long alone. He wanted to know her fully, to trust her fully, but the empty chair reminded him that some doors were not so easily opened. The past and the present pressed against each other like two forces waiting to collide, and the cowboy realized that the story unfolding in his house was larger than either of them, filled with secrets and questions that demanded answers he was not yet ready to give. One morning, as the sun broke over the horizon in streaks of fire and gold, she brought him a cup of coffee with a smile that carried the weight of unspoken stories. He took it, feeling the warmth seep into his hands and the silence stretch between them. Outside, the prairie shimmered, the wind whispering across the tall grass. And he realized that the calm of the morning was temporary, a fragile moment between storms yet to come. He could sense that the land had its own memory, that the neighbor's eyes hid more than idle curiosity, and that her presence brought not only comfort but risk. The cowboy knew that something was approaching, something he could neither see nor name. The empty chair beside him seemed to lean forward, patient and insistent, as if aware of the tension threading through the house. He took a slow breath, feeling the weight of choices yet to be made, the fragile trust he had begun to place in her, the mysteries that clung to her like shadows. The prairie stretched wide and endless, promising freedom but also danger, and he understood that in the days ahead, the quiet life he had carved for himself would be tested in ways he could not yet imagine. The fire flickered low, the wind whispered softly outside, and the cowboy and the girl shared a quiet moment in the kitchen. The table was set, the food warm, and the empty chair waited, a silent challenge hanging between them. Neither spoke, yet the air was heavy with anticipation, the promise of revelation, and the subtle, persistent question: who would fill the chair, and what truths would it demand when the time came? The prairie held its breath along with them, and the story of their lives, intertwined in ways both fragile and inevitable, was only just beginning to unfold. The days that followed carried a strange, restless energy. The prairie, which had once seemed wide and inviting, now felt like a stage for unseen eyes. The cowboy noticed the change first in the wind, how it shifted unexpectedly, rustling through the dry grass with a whisper of warning. The horses snorted and pawed at the ground, and even the dogs stayed closer to the house than usual. He found himself glancing toward the distant hills more often, noting every shadow, every movement, wondering if the quiet life he had hoped for was slipping away. She moved through the house like a quiet force, filling the space with warmth and rhythm, but the subtle tension between them grew. Their conversations remained polite, practical, yet there were moments when her gaze lingered on him with a depth he couldn't read. It wasn't just curiosity, it was a mixture of caution and understanding, as if she knew the land held more than he had admitted, and that he was only beginning to grasp what shadows lingered around the edges. Tried to focus on the work, on the chores, on the endless rhythm of the ranch, but the feeling of being watched, of being measured by forces he couldn't see, refused to fade. One morning, the cowboy discovered footprints along the creek that didn't belong to him. They were small, deliberate, and disappeared into the tall grass, as if whoever had walked there had vanished into the earth itself. He called her to the edge of the trees, showing the prints. She knelt, tracing them lightly with her fingers, her face unreadable. "They've been here before," she said quietly, her voice calm, but there was an edge to it that made him tense. "Not long ago, maybe a few nights. He stared at the footprints, the unease in his chest growing heavier. The house, the table, even the empty chair suddenly felt vulnerable, fragile against the unknown. The local townsfolk, who had once watched them with mild curiosity, began to shift in tone. A neighbor passing by the fence would let his eyes linger too long or stop mid-sentence, as if weighing whether to speak. Small remarks about strangers in the area, about cattle that had gone missing or men seen riding at odd hours, started to creep into conversation. The cowboy felt the subtle pressure of scrutiny. The sense that his life and hers were no longer separate from the land's history and the stories buried in it. He tried to shrug it off, to ignore it, but the tension was infectious, settling like dust in every corner of the house. She had her own quiet ways of dealing with it. At night, she would sit by the fire, sketching small symbols in a notebook with careful, precise strokes. Sometimes he would catch glimpses of what looked like maps or notes or markings he didn't understand. He asked once what they were, but she only shook her head and said they were for remembering. He didn't press. He had learned that some doors weren't meant to be opened until the time was right. Still, the air between them felt heavier, each silence carrying the weight of questions neither wanted to voice. The first real incident came on a day when the sun was high and the prairie seemed still. He had ridden to check the northern fence line and returned to find the barn door partially open. Nothing appeared missing, nothing disturbed, but the horses were tense, ears flicking, muscles taut. Was already outside, her hands on her hips, a frown creasing her forehead. "Someone's been inside," she said, almost to herself. "I felt it before you even came." He scanned the area, noting the lack of footprints leading away from the barn, the odd stillness of the grass. Whoever had been there had left no trace, except for the whisper of intrusion that neither of them could ignore. Over the next few days, small disturbances continued. Feed sacks shifted, a tool missing from the workbench, a shadow glimpsed moving across the yard at dusk. He began riding out later than usual, scanning the horizon with hawk-like focus, and she stayed closer to the house. Her eyes sharp, her movements quiet but deliberate. He realized that the comfort she had brought into the house had begun to intertwine with danger. The warmth of the kitchen and the laughter at the table were under threat from unseen hands. And yet, even with the tension building, there was a strange bond forming, a shared understanding that neither would let the other face the uncertainty alone. He started noticing other patterns too. The local men seemed to avoid the ranch more than usual, passing on horseback with averted eyes, or leaving quickly after a brief conversation. Whispers in the saloon hinted at disputes over land, rivalries that had lasted generations, and rumors of strangers moving through the county. He tried to learn more, but no one would speak openly. The prairie held its own secrets, and he felt the weight of them pressing down on the ranch, as if the land itself was testing his resolve. Meanwhile, she continued to work in the kitchen, her presence a steady counterpoint to the growing unease. The meals she prepared became almost ceremonial, each plate laid with care, each bite infused with something he couldn't name. The table was no longer just a place to eat. It was a place of strategy, a place where decisions could be made quietly and carefully. And yet, the empty chair remained, a silent observer, holding space for questions neither of them could answer yet. There were moments when he glimpsed her past in fleeting expressions, a shadow of regret, a flicker of fear, a sudden stiffness at a particular sound. He wanted to ask, to understand, but he feared that probing too deeply would break the fragile trust between them. And still, curiosity gnawed at him. Every story she told, every memory she hinted at, carried a subtle tension, suggestion that the past was not done with her and perhaps not done with him either. The cowboy began patrolling the property more rigorously, riding the fences at odd hours, checking the barns, scanning the horizon for movement. Nights became restless, sleep a distant memory as he listened to the wind and the faint sounds of the prairie, trying to distinguish between nature and the unknown. She would sometimes join him, quietly, walking beside the horses as they moved along the lines of the fence. In those moments, he felt the depth of their connection, the silent reliance they had developed, and yet the unspoken question of trust remained like a shadow over every step. One evening, after a long day of work, he returned to find her standing by the window, hands pressed to the glass as she stared into the darkening prairie. He sensed something different in her posture, a tension he hadn't seen before. "It's coming closer," she said quietly. Her voice was calm, but the subtle tremor betrayed the concern beneath. He leaned against the doorway, listening to the wind and the distant rustle of grass, knowing that her instincts had never been wrong. Whoever or whatever had been disturbing the ranch was no longer content to stay hidden. That night the wind carried a new sound, low and deliberate, like hooves striking the earth in steady rhythm. The dogs barked and then fell silent, ears flattened, watching the dark edges of the property. The cowboy grabbed his coat and lantern, stepping outside into the chill night air. She followed without hesitation, her presence a quiet reassurance amid the rising tension. They moved together, scanning the horizon, listening to every whisper of the prairie, aware that the moment of confrontation was drawing near. Even as they waited, the table in the kitchen seemed to reflect the quiet storm outside. The food remained, the lantern burned steadily, and the empty chair loomed, a reminder that the stakes were no longer just about comfort or companionship. It was about survival, about trust, and about the fragile lines between what was known and what remained hidden. Each glance between them carried meaning, a negotiation of courage and caution, as if both were aware that the next move could change everything. She finally spoke, her voice low and steady. They're not just passing through. Someone's watching, and they've been here before. I've felt it in the land, in the air, in the way the horses react. They're waiting for something. The cowboy's jaw tightened as he considered her words. He had been preparing for trouble, but now it felt more real, more imminent. The tension that had been simmering beneath the surface had begun to boil, threatening to spill over and disrupt the fragile life they had built together. He realized, with a growing sense of unease, that the empty chair at the table was more than a symbol of loneliness. It was a space for choices that had yet to be made, for decisions that would test their trust, their courage, and their ability to face whatever force was approaching. He could feel the prairie holding its breath with them, the wind carrying the weight of unseen eyes, and the night stretching longer than it should. The storm that had been building on the horizon of their lives was no longer invisible. Shadows moved differently now, sounds carried hidden meaning, and the quiet rhythm of the ranch had become a tense dance of vigilance and strategy. He looked at her, sensing the depth of her instincts and the courage beneath her calm exterior, and knew that, whatever came next, they would face it together, or not at all. The empty chair waited, the prairie whispered, and the night stretched endless before them. The story of the ranch, of the land, of the cowboy and the girl, was far from resolved. The conflict that had been quietly mounting now pressed in from every direction, and neither of them could predict the outcome. All they could do was wait, watch, and prepare. Knowing that the choices they made in the coming hours would shape the rest of their lives, the night had fallen heavy and dark, pressing down on the prairie like a living thing. The wind had shifted, carrying a chill that crawled through the cracks of the wooden house and made the lantern flames flicker nervously. The cowboy stood at the edge of the porch, coat drawn tight, eyes scanning the horizon, trying to catch a hint of movement in the shadows. She appeared behind him silently, hands folded over the edge of the railing, her presence steady and calm, but he could sense the tension coiled beneath her quiet exterior. Something was coming, and it was closer than either of them had expected. For days the disturbances had grown more frequent. Footprints that vanished without trace, glimpses of figures just at the edge of the tree line, and the strange feeling of being watched no matter where they were. He had doubled his patrols, riding the fences at odd hours, but nothing had prepared him for the sense of immediacy that tonight brought. She had insisted on staying close to the house, her eyes sharp, moving with the quiet confidence of someone who had faced threats before. He realized that her instincts were as sharp as any rifle, and that her presence was more than comfort, it was survival. Inside, the kitchen smelled of warm bread and stew, the only element of normalcy in the tension-stricken house. Yet even here, the quiet was heavy. The table, once a place of laughter and simple meals, now felt like the center of a fragile world balanced on the edge of uncertainty. The empty chair beside him seemed more insistent than ever, a reminder that there were choices he had yet to make, and dangers he could not yet see. He could feel the prairie outside pressing in, its vast openness suddenly threatening, the shadows stretching long and dark across the land he had called home for so long. She spoke softly, almost to herself. "They're not here yet, but they're near. I can feel it." Her words sent a chill down his spine, not for the threat itself, but for the certainty in her voice. He knew she wasn't guessing. She never did. Every movement, every sound, Every subtle shift in the night carried meaning she could read. He wanted to ask her more, to understand the depth of what she knew. But he sensed that she would only reveal it when the moment demanded it. The wind shifted again, carrying with it the faint sound of hooves striking the hard ground, distant but deliberate. The cowboy tensed, hand hovering over the rifle slung across his shoulder. She moved beside him silently, her eyes scanning the horizon with a calm he envied but could not fully share. The sound grew closer, and now he could hear voices, low and cautious, speaking in hushed tones. The prairie, which had always felt endless and open, suddenly seemed like a trap, a stage for events beyond their control. He remembered the empty chair, the symbol of loneliness and trust and possibility, and realized that its meaning had expanded. It wasn't just about filling a space, it was about choice, about courage, and about standing together against forces that could not be ignored. Every instinct told him that the night would not end quietly, that whatever approached had come with purpose, and that the quiet life they had begun to build was on the brink of being torn apart. Footsteps on the gravel road outside made them both pause, signaled him with a subtle gesture, a tilt of her head toward the back door. They moved together, silent and deliberate, the tension between them stretching taut like a bowstring. The sounds grew louder, closer, until he could make out the shape of a man riding alone, lantern swinging gently at his side, eyes scanning the land with cautious alertness. The cowboy and the girl watched from the shadows, waiting, measuring, feeling the pulse of the night beat in sync with their own. Inside, the house seemed to shrink, the walls pressing in with quiet urgency. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of the wind, every rustle of leaves outside felt magnified. She moved to the table, setting down a small knife, a gesture both practical and symbolic, a readiness he couldn't ignore. He took his position by the doorway, rifle steady, muscles tense, knowing that the coming confrontation could demand every ounce of skill and courage he possessed. The man on horseback approached cautiously, lantern casting shadows that danced across the grass. He dismounted slowly, scanning the house, and then, as if sensing their presence, he stopped. The silence that followed was almost unbearable, a taut thread stretched between them, ready to snap. The cowboy felt the weight of the empty chair, the unspoken question of trust, the threat of the unknown, pressing down on him all at once. Every decision he made in the coming moments would echo far beyond the walls of the house. The girl whispered, her voice barely audible over the night wind. "He's not alone. There are more coming, waiting in the trees." Her words sent a fresh wave of tension through him. He had suspected they weren't just being watched, but now the reality of multiple threats crystallized with sharp clarity. The peaceful nights, the quiet meals, the soft glow of the kitchen lantern, they had all been temporary reprieves. The danger was real, immediate, and closing in. He felt the need to protect, to act, but the uncertainty gnawed at him. Who were these people? Were they after him, after her, or was it the land itself they coveted? Questions circled in his mind, each one a thorn twisting tighter around his resolve. He glanced at her, seeing the same mixture of focus and caution he felt, understanding that they were bound now not just by the house or the table, but by the necessity to face the threat together. The wind carried another sound, a faint whispering, almost like voices speaking across the grass, careful, controlled, testing the boundaries. The cowboy raised his rifle slightly, finger near the trigger, heart pounding, knowing that the next moments could erupt into violence. She stepped closer, placing a hand lightly on his arm, a gesture of reassurance and solidarity. He felt a spark of connection, a reminder of why the empty chair had mattered all along. It was a test, a challenge to step beyond isolation and into shared risk. From the shadows, a figure emerged, a second rider moving slowly, deliberately, signaling the presence of others unseen. The night suddenly felt alive with anticipation, the kind that prickled the skin and made the hair on the back of the neck stand. The prairie, which had always seemed a quiet expanse, now teemed with hidden eyes. Each movement uncertain, each sound amplified by fear and instinct. Inside, the lantern flickered, casting long shadows across the walls, across the table, across the empty chair that seemed to loom like a silent witness to the tension. She moved with calm precision, securing the doors and checking the windows, her eyes sharp, alert, yet never losing focus on him. He realized how much he relied on her presence, how her instincts had become as vital as his own, and how precarious the line between safety and danger had become in this one house on the prairie. The distant sounds of hooves grew louder, closer, carrying a rhythm that suggested purpose, coordination, and intent. He crouched by the doorway, rifle aimed, heart hammering, aware that any misstep could change everything. She mirrored his movements, silent and efficient, eyes scanning the darkness beyond the wooden walls. They were on the edge of something immense, the calm before a storm that neither of them could fully anticipate. Suddenly, a sharp sound, the snap of a branch, the whisper of cloths, made them both freeze. The cowboy's pulse raced as he adjusted his aim, straining to see through the dark. She shifted beside him, her hand brushing his shoulder, steadying him, signaling readiness. The presence of multiple figures hidden in the shadows had been confirmed, and the weight of it pressed down like the prairie itself was closing in around them. He thought of the table, of the empty chair, and of the meals they had shared. He thought of the quiet conversations, the glimpses of her past she had allowed him to see, and the bond that had grown stronger with each day. And he realized that the conflict they faced now was not just about the threats outside, it was about trust, it's about courage, and about whether they could rely on each other when the stakes were higher than ever. The wind shifted again, carrying the faint scent of smoke and dust, and he felt a tight knot of anticipation in his chest. The unseen figures were moving closer, coordinating, testing the boundaries, waiting for a sign. He glanced at her, and in her eyes he saw the same calculation, the same tension, the same readiness for whatever was coming. The house, the prairie, the table, and the empty chair, they were all part of the stage for the climax that was approaching. A moment that could define the rest of their lives. A distant voice called out, low and measured, testing, taunting, carrying over the grass. He couldn't make out the words, but the tone was deliberate, a signal of intent. She whispered, "They're surrounding us, waiting for the first move." The cowboy's grip tightened on the rifle. The quiet life they had tried to carve on the prairie, the warmth and rhythm she had brought into the house. The fragile trust that had grown between them, all of it was on the verge of being tested. The lantern flickered again, shadows stretching longer, more menacing, across the floor and walls. Every sound outside, the crunch of gravel, the rustle of grass, the faint brush of movement, amplified the tension, making the night feel alive with possibility and danger. He knew the moments ahead would demand everything he had: focus, courage, trust, and instinct. The empty chair waited, silent and unwavering, as if aware that what was about to unfold would change the house, the prairie, and their lives forever. The wind carried another whisper, closer, sharper. The cowboy and the girl exchanged a glance, each understanding that the storm had arrived at their doorstep. The prairie held its breath, the night stretched endless and heavy, and the stage was set for the climax they had been approaching unknowingly with each passing day, each shared meal, each glance across the table. And as the distant figures shifted in the dark, moving closer, the tension reached its peak, leaving the cowboy gripping the rifle, the girl at his side, and the empty chair waiting. The first movement of action came suddenly. Shadows darted across the edge of the clearing, and the distant hooves finally thundered into the open. The cowboy tightened his grip on the rifle, muscles coiled like springs, while she stayed close, her eyes scanning every motion. The figures emerged from the darkness, men with hard faces, rough clothing, and eyes that carried both suspicion and intent. They had been testing, watching, circling, waiting for the slightest misstep. But tonight, the stillness of the house and the precision of its occupants had left them exposed. The first man hesitated at the edge of the yard, hands raised slightly, signaling caution. The cowboy's voice rang out firm but controlled. "You're on my land. Speak your business, or move along." The wind carried the words, sharp and unwavering. She stood beside him, steady, letting the presence of two figures, man and woman, convey strength without violence. The tension was nearly unbearable, the moments stretching as each side measured the other, testing courage, patience, and resolve. Finally, the lead man spoke. His voice was rough but honest, carrying no immediate threat. "We were looking for trouble, but maybe we found something else. Heard there was someone new in these parts. Didn't know what to expect." The cowboy's eyes narrowed, noting the slight hesitation, the undercurrent of fear in their tone. He realized that this confrontation was not just about land or suspicion, it was about survival, about respect, and about choices that defined a man's character in the open plains. She stepped forward, calm but deliberate, her voice cutting through the tension. "You're on private land. You can stay and talk civilly, or you can leave. Any harm done, and there'll be consequences." There was authority in her tone, born not of threat, but of knowledge and confidence. The men shifted, exchanging glances, clearly unprepared for the quiet strength emanating from the woman whose presence had become central to the house. After a long pause, the leader finally lowered his head slightly, acknowledgement in his gesture. "We mean no harm, just cautious. Things have been tense around here, with other folks passing through, cattle moving, stories of strangers." He glanced toward the girl, recognition dawning. "Heard you're the one keeping this place together? Ain't easy." The cowboy's grip relaxed slightly, but his eyes remained vigilant. Trust wasn't given lightly, not on the prairie, and he could feel the subtle negotiation in the air. Slowly, the men dismounted and moved closer, careful, deliberate. Conversations began to flow, cautious at first, then easing into stories of the land, of past rivalries, and the odd incidents that had stirred suspicion. The cowboy listened, the rifle resting now but never far from reach. While she contributed quietly, her insight bridging gaps and offering understanding where miscommunication had reigned. She revealed bits of knowledge about the land and its people, details that had escaped the local men, and in doing so she began to dismantle the fear that had built up in the darkness. Hours passed, and the tension gradually eased, replaced by cautious camaraderie. The cowboy noticed subtle changes, nods of respect, shared stories of long rides and hardships, and a growing acknowledgement that the house and its inhabitants were not merely isolated strangers but participants. In the life of the prairie, she had, without confrontation, transformed suspicion into dialogue, conflict into understanding. The empty chair at the table, which had once symbolized solitude and potential risk, now seemed to glow with possibility, the promise of inclusion and shared human experience. Later, when the visitors had left, the night finally returned to its quiet rhythm. The prairie, stretched wide under the stars, felt less threatening, almost gentle again. The cowboy and the girl walked back to the house, the lantern casting warm light across their path. He glanced at her, realizing fully for the first time how integral she had become, not just to the house, but to his life, to the rhythm of the ranch, and to the resilience he had rediscovered within himself. The trust that had slowly built between them had been tested in the crucible of uncertainty, and it had held firm. Inside, the table was set once more, a simple meal awaiting them. She placed plates carefully, a quiet ritual of comfort and normalcy. The cowboy took his seat, eyes flicking to the empty chair beside him. This time, the space didn't feel lonely or threatening. It was a place of choice, of invitation, and he realized he could fill it with someone willing to stand beside him, to share both the burden and the joy of life on the prairie. The meals they shared no longer carried just sustenance. They carried meaning, connection, and the quiet victory of endurance. He spoke first, softly, almost hesitantly. "You did more than cook tonight. You saved this place." She smiled, a subtle, knowing expression, not boastful, but proud in the quietest way. "We did it together," she said, placing a hand on the table near his. "You never asked me to be anything more than I am." "And that's why it worked." The cowboy nodded, understanding that the bond they had formed was neither forced nor fragile. It was forged through trust, vigilance, and shared experience. The following days returned to the steady rhythm of ranch life, but something fundamental had shifted. The house, once quiet and tense, now thrummed with quiet strength and companionship. The prairie, once threatening in its vastness, became a landscape of opportunity and freedom, where vigilance was balanced by the comfort of trust. The neighbors, once suspicious and watchful, began to offer nods of respect, understanding that the house was no longer just an isolated dwelling, but a place of resilience and quiet leadership. The cowboy found himself more open, more willing to share his thoughts and stories. And he noticed that she, too, revealed glimpses of her past, memories, and experiences that had shaped her strength and wisdom. Together, they rebuilt the fragile trust that uncertainty had tested, filling not just the table but the home with a warmth that was both tangible and emotional. The empty chair, which had loomed as a symbol of risk and possibility, was now a seat of choice and belonging, a silent testament to the courage required to embrace connection. Over time, they discovered that the disturbances and shadows on the prairie had been tied to old rivalries, land disputes, and wandering cattle rustlers. The events of that night, which had tested their instincts and courage, became a turning point, not only in their understanding of the land, but in the way they approached life together. By standing firm, relying on instinct, and trusting each other, they had not only defended their home, but also established a sense of community and order in the surrounding area. Evenings returned to quiet moments of reflection, where the cowboy and the girl would sit by the fire or at the table, sharing stories, laughs, and the simple peace that came from knowing the threats had passed. The table was always set for two, and sometimes, when the night was calm and the prairie seemed endless, the empty chair held a sense of invitation, a symbol of the lives they could touch and the trust they could extend to others. The cowboy often thought back to the earliest days of her arrival, the first smells of bread and coffee, the quiet confidence in her eyes, the way she had seemed to belong in the house without a word of demand. He realized how much of his life had been defined by solitude, and how much of it had changed simply because he had been willing to let someone else into the rhythm of his days. The lessons were clear. Trust was a risk, courage was necessary, and companionship could transform not only the heart, but the very land beneath one's feet. She, too, reflected on the journey. Her travels had taught her caution, resilience, and the art of reading people and land alike. But it was here, on this ranch, beside this man, and within the walls of a house that had once been quiet and empty, that she found the unexpected, a place where her skills mattered, her instincts were trusted, and her presence created not just meals, but security, comfort, and connection. The bond between them became the foundation for a life built on respect, mutual understanding, and the quiet joy of shared days. Seasons changed. The prairie bloomed and faded with the sun and the wind. The cattle moved and multiplied. The house, which had once been a space of tension and loneliness, became a center of life and resilience. And through it all, the table remained full, the meals nourishing not only the body, but the spirit. And the empty chair stood as a reminder of the choices that had shaped them, the courage that had defined them, and the connection that had transformed them both. In the end, the cowboy understood something he had long forgotten, that life on the prairie was never meant to be lived alone. The land demanded vigilance, the wind carried both stories and warnings, and the open sky promised freedom and uncertainty alike. But with trust, courage, and companionship, even the most uncertain nights could give way to light, and the empty chair could become a place of belonging rather than loss. He looked across the table one evening, seeing her smile as she served the simple meal she had prepared with care. He felt a calm settle into his chest, the tension of past nights fading, replaced by quiet satisfaction. They had faced the unknown, they had relied on each other, and they had survived. The prairie stretched beyond the horizon, wide and endless, and yet for the first time, it felt welcoming rather than threatening. The house, the table, the land, and the bond they had forged together had become a story of resilience, trust, and hope, a story that would endure long after the shadows of that night had passed. And as the lanterns burned softly and the wind whispered across the grass, the cowboy finally let himself sit back, glancing at the empty chair beside him. It was no longer a symbol of solitude or fear. It was a place of invitation, a quiet reminder that life was richer when shared, and that the courage to trust and to connect could transform even the loneliest corners of the prairie into a home. They had become a life worth living together.